Okay, so now on to talk about Mesoamerica and Tenochtitlan in a necessarily abbreviated way, and I am going to be using my notes more for this. And I'll be taking you on a kind of a fast tour through a large number of cultures in Mesoamerica. It's good that you have this recording so you can refer to it anytime you want, but there's, also lots to read about this. It's really what I would recommend actually is you just sort of relax and listen. And at the end, I'm going to actually ask you to reflect on what you've noticed, and just like sit down and write, from memory and from impressions, whatever your impressions are, anything that was particularly interesting or any patterns that you noticed in immediately afterwards and reflecting. So try not to get attached to specific dates and times and places. I'll be giving you that kind of information. If you like that kind of information, you can certainly take note of it. I also am going to post for you all, or maybe hand out a list of terms just so you can have them for the spelling and things like that. But really, mostly I want you to try to just glean impressions if you can. So Tenochtitlan was the great city of the people who have come to be known as the Aztecs. And like other Mesoamerican cities before it, it had enormous cultural, political, religious significance for the people who built it and lived in it and near it. And I'll talk about the city at the very end of the lecture. But first, I'm going to introduce you to some of its most significant predecessors in terms of the impact that they had on Tenochtitlan, which was the significant city at the time, the significant city for this particular region and for what we have come to know as the Aztec Empire at the time that the Spaniards arrived. So Tenochtitlan had only been a powerful city of religious and political power for about 100 years before the Spaniards arrived. Before its particular rise to power, there'd been a number of great states in the region whose legacies in terms of cosmology and political organization and ways of envisioning the world, the divine nature, were significant to the people who lived in the time of the arrival of Europeans. So by 1500 BC, settled agriculture was being practiced in Mesoamerica. And with this began the development of the small communities and small states that I was talking about in the last video. So to give you an idea of what I mean when I say small state, these states were about the size of a county here in Columbus, for instance. But they were powerful and stable. These small states were the most common social and political entities from about 1200 BC on. And the rise and fall of the vast states, the things that we call that were more aptly called empires, was also a consistent fact in Mesoamerica, but those, rose and fall. So the large states developed, and then they sometimes incorporated the smaller states that already existed, or related to them as subordinate but autonomous entities that they took tribute from, for instance. And when they fell in political power, they often left behind these large states, often left behind temples and ball courts and other big architectural structures. And then these structures often became important ceremonial sites, centers of religious and political power for future large states. And they were, hearkened back to and often incorporated into stories as their political and religious predecessors and ancestors, etc. So a lot of meaning was associated with these large cities. I mean, with these, with cities, yes, but with these large architectural structures is what I mean to say. The large states also elaborated histories of particular deities, we might call them, or representations of divine and natural energy, sometimes in complex systems of writing or painting, other times in carvings and in oral traditions. And then these histories became important memories or legacies that these future cultures drew on and learned from and built upon. So the earliest of these great states were the Olmecs, who were first visible about 1400 BC, but seemed to flourish most prominently from between 1200 BC and 400 BC, and then disappeared mysteriously about 300 BC. They were located in the swamps and grasslands of the Mexican Gulf Coast, especially in what's now Western Tabasco and southern Veracruz, for those of you who know that region. And you can look at the map that I will also post with in a series of images on a PowerPoint. I'm not going to try to do it now because I couldn't figure it out with this particular technology. So, but we're going to look at it hopefully in class as well. So we know very little about the Olmecs, really. We know very little about them at all. We know very little about their organization. We know very little about their cultural and religious practices, but what they left behind, these enormous heads. You may have seen these heads, these statues of these enormous heads. So you can look at that on the PowerPoint as well. We know that they were structured into many smaller villages that surrounded these large ceremonial and economic centers, much like the Mexica, or who came to be known as the Aztecs of the later period. Also, like the Mexica, it seems that they had ball courts, and they might have practiced some form of sacrificial bloodletting that I was mentioning before. The jaguar was an important figure for the Olmecs. We've found a lot of jaguar statues and representations, small ones as well as medium-sized ones. And also it seems that the jaguar was was connected to ideas of and forces of rain and fertility. So some scholars think that the huge heads were actually related to a jaguar rain god. So, people who know a lot more about this than me find a connection between those two things. So the jaguar remained a centrally important way that Mesoamericans envisioned divine and natural forces. Even 1,300 years later, Mexica priests would wear jaguar skins and invoke the power of the divine jaguar in relation to the divine force of rain. I keep saying the word divine because this is how we think about it. I'm not sure that that's exactly the most accurate way of talking about it, because again, that sort of signals something above nature or beyond nature, where as the sacred seems to have been envisioned in a much more imminent way. But the jaguar was related to rain and was related to the forces of rain throughout this long time period in Mesoamerica. The Olmecs were also the first that we know of to depict Quetzalcoatl in their carvings. And Quetzalcoatl is the winged serpent. And if you want to look at the PowerPoint, you can see Olmec representations of Quetzalcoatl and then later representations of Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl, who had different names, in different times, but was a great plumed serpent deity or figure, symbol. And the Olmecs probably did not call the image Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl is a Nahuatl word. They probably called it something else, but we don't know what they called it. But the image was really similar to that which is found throughout Mesoamerica from 1200 BC on, all the way on to the time of the Spaniards. So this image that was very frequent from 1200 BC on was found among the Olmecs even earlier than that. But Quetzalcoatl, the name, comes from the Nahuatl word for quetzal, which is a precious green feather that comes from a particular bird, and then coatl, which is a serpent. So it's this, feathered serpent is what Quetzalcoatl means. Scholars have written libraries about Quetzalcoatl, and there are a great many interpretations of the stories left by the many cultures that revered this figure. But a few commonalities seem to show up over and over again, and I'm going to focus on that. The bird represented the sky, which was associated with rain and fertility, and also the ordering of the cosmos. So order, and rain and fertility and creation and birth, etc. This side of the dualism. The serpent represented the earth, which was both regenerative and destructive. So the earth had this, had those forces, both of those forces working within it. And the serpent represented the earth. You can start to think how people with this notion of Quetzalcoatl as an important figure and the serpent as related to the earth, which is both destructive and regenerative, might understand the story of Adam and Eve and the serpent when Christianity comes to town, and how that might get interpreted differently than the Spaniards wanted it to be interpreted, and also how the Spaniards might have related to Quetzalcoatl and might have related to the figure of the serpent in Nahuatl and Mesoamerican in general symbology. So that's a side note. But at any rate, so Quetzalcoatl was a uniting of the sky and the earth. That was a figure that represented uniting the sky and the earth. So in some ways, both the sky and the earth were related to what we might think of as fertility, but the sky represented a kind of cosmic birth, a cosmic genesis. Rain was a gift from the sky, and the sky had the potential to give form and order to a chaotic but generative earth, okay? And that's important for how Quetzalcoatl was related to and the place of this figure in the sort of cosmic history of at least the Aztecs, the ones that we have the most information about. The center of the earth was envisioned as a place where things went to die or degenerate, but also a place where things were born again. So only through the union of the sky and the earth is such a cycle of birth and death and regeneration possible. And Quetzalcoatl represented that union. An extremely important ceremonial center, which was built about 200 BC in the Valley of Mexico near current-day Mexico City, was Teotihuacan, which is not Tenochtitlan. Okay, Teotihuacan is a ways away from Tenochtitlan. This was a really important ceremonial center. We know that it was built a long, we know it was built 200 BC, so a long time before the Spaniards arrived, a long time before Tenochtitlan was built. We know almost nothing beyond that. We all know almost nothing about the people who actually built Teotihuacan, except that they seem to be the dominant cultural religious force, the leaders of one of these big states, these big empires, from about 200 BC to about 650 AD, okay? Teotihuacan had enormous pyramids, they still exist, and had images of the rain god Tlaloc, T-L-A-L-O-C, which also appeared in Oaxaca and was later adopted by the Mexica people. So in Teotihuacan, we see an image of the rain god that's not just a jaguar, that is Tlaloc, and that shows up in Oaxaca and shows up later for the Mexica people. But Quetzalcoatl was also central at these carvings of Teotihuacan. So we have now, two different places, origins of, or two different places where this figure Quetzalcoatl is really important. The culture that built Teotihuacan disappeared around 650 AD, but the huge pyramids and the ceremonial center continued to be used by other cultures that came into the area, that rose up and took power. And probably in between, when the big empires were not at their height, certainly local communities must have related to this ceremonial center in some kind of important way. And in fact, oral traditions protected by and kept by people who live near Teotihuacan now, who often are people who work as tour guides and things, will, if you can be blessed with the opportunity to talk with them, have all kinds of stories about the ways that people did use this place, and in fact say that people use some of these ceremonial sites for passing on ancient wisdom today, and they do. There's teaching workshops that happen, now much more officially than they used to be. But so there's a long tradition of relating to these ceremonial sites in ways that we don't really have access to. But we do know that the rising states also related to the Teotihuacan as a sort of birth of the gods place, and a place where ancestors were. So in fact, Teotihuacan means the place of the gods. So an important group called the Toltecs, who existed long before Mexica, and then later the Mexica people, who we think of as the Aztecs. Don't get confused. I mean, it's okay if you're confused. Don't worry about it. You don't have to keep it all straight. I'm going to post these notes as well, so you can look back on them in a written form if that's easier for you. But the Toltecs and the Mexica, much later Mexica, both referred to this place as Teotihuacan, which is the place of the gods. We don't know what the people who built it called it. We don't know anything about them, except that they were important, like I said, from 200 BC to 650 AD. So I'm going to return to the Toltecs in a bit, but I'm just talking right now about Teotihuacan and wanted to mention the Toltecs and the Aztecs as both extremely important, big empires that related to Teotihuacan in this way. But the Toltecs come a little bit later, and so I want to go back and now talk about the Mayans. Because they are perhaps the most well-known great state in Mesoamerica is the Mayan Empire. And the Maya had an enormous influence on religion and culture and politics of the region, and was the longest lasting of any of the great states or cultures in Mesoamerica. Because of ceremonial and cultural and architectural similarities, it seems, with the Olmecs, and because the Olmecs slowly declined from about 400 BC to 300 BC, while the Maya were slowly developing at that same time, some scholars think that a gradual southern Olmec migration led to the emergence of Mayan culture in the south. Okay, so remember the Olmecs were from a different region, and I'm trying to see if I have a map here to show you, but I think it's all on my, I'll you can look at it on the whatchamacallit, but basically from Tabasco and Veracruz, some scholars think that the Olmecs migrated south and became, or some parts of Olmec culture gave rise to the Mayan culture, or at least interacted with people that were already there and developed what came to be known as the Mayan Empire. Mayan society and high imperial religion first emerged as a powerful force visibly around 300 BC in Chiapas and the Yucatan. But then they later flourished throughout an enormous area and stretched throughout, all of southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Western Honduras, and El Salvador. So they were huge, a very, very big stretch of what we now call Mesoamerica. They developed ceremonial centers in the tropical forest, which consisted of enormous stone temple pyramids and platforms and observatories to see the stars. They were enormously advanced in astronomy. And they also had these big ball courts. that show up everywhere, all throughout Mesoamerica. Scholars talk about the Mayan society as being divided into three general periods: the pre-classic, which is, for those of you who like dates, before 300 BC, the classic Mayan era, which was sort of the height of, of their political strength, which is from 300 BC to 900 AD, and then the post-classic period, which is, beginning of the decline, etc., which is after 900 AD and stretches to the time of the European conquest. So when Spaniards arrived, the Mayans that they found were smaller communities or smaller states. There was not the evidence of the powerful Mayan empire. And in fact, when the Spaniards arrived to Yucatan, they did not think there was a major political state, because they saw more evidence of smaller political organizations. And until they got to central Mexico, until they got to Mexico, what's now Mexico City, and Tenochtitlan, they didn't think that they were really encountering any major big states. And then they were blown away by what they found in Tenochtitlan, but that's for a later story. So, but during the classic phase, so again, about 300 BC to 900 AD, some extremely important ceremonial centers of pyramids and platforms developed in Palenque in southeastern Mexico and in Tikal, which is in modern-day Guatemala. The Mayans developed, like I said, highly, highly advanced studies of astronomy that blow our minds today still, in which they accurately predicted movements of heavenly bodies and eclipses and other celestial events decades and centuries in advance. In fact, their calendars are still largely accurate for things that are going on today astronomically. So their calendars, and they had these, complex numbering systems that are really wild and fascinating, that have symbolic significance to them, and astronomical observations. All of these had deep, what we would call religious significance, in the sense that they contained representations of what looked like cosmological predictions and happenings and ideas. But again, these things were interrelated for these people, as best we can tell. Their Mayans' view of the cosmos seemed to link the earth and the heavens that went beyond a reverence for rain and the sky, but which was understood as a part of the great universe. So compared to the Mexica, for instance, and Quetzalcoatl being really a huge focus, thinking about the relationship between the sun and the moon and rain and the gift from the sky to the earth and rebirth and generation and all of this. The cosmos was involved for sure, and the sky was involved, and the sun and the moon were involved. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the notion of this vast universe with the movement of the stars and heavenly bodies, like way far away, and really a very, not advance is the wrong word in this context, a really highly elaborated notion of a big universe that's far bigger than what we can see, that's far bigger than like concepts that are like galaxies and multiple galaxies in the universe and things like that. There was a notion of that, and the rain and the sky and the earth was just a small part of this vast universe. So the Mayans had a notion of a vast cosmos that seemed to be extremely important and was a big focus in their calendrical and numerical systems of math and systems of scientific observation. So this had a lasting significance in Mesoamerica, even if it was never quite as rich and repeated with the same level of vigor that it was for the Mayans. Their conception of time was deeply influential from then on, throughout all of Mesoamerican traditions. Time was understood as existing in these sacred repeating cycles of distinct ages. in which the world ended and then began again in a new age. And we don't know how literal the understanding of the ending of these eras were. It comes down to us in the written and depicted stories as endings, as like Noah and the Ark kind of endings. In fact, there was one of the eras ended in a big flood, and some of the eras ended in other things, but we don't know how to relate, just like people relate in many different ways to the stories of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, for instance. These kinds of stories, people think of them as symbols, some people think of them as literal. We don't know exactly how the ancient Maya thought of these things, but we do know that there was a real sense of cyclical time, and that there had been multiple worlds before, and that there would continue on to be multiple worlds after the one that they lived in. New ages, new worlds, new eras, etc. The jaguar continued to be a significant presence for the Maya, but was also associated with the warrior rain god, which held and controlled lightning and thunder. This divinity for the Mayans was called Chak, Chaak. The Mexica called a rain god that was very similar, Tlaloc, but the Mexica representation of Tlaloc was very similar to the Mayan Chak as well. So there was clearly a relationship there. Mexica priests, when I say Mexica, I'm talking about, let me just say, I'll talk about this later, but so there's not confusion. We always talk about Aztecs, but the Aztecs were not a people. There was such a thing called the Aztec Empire, and the Aztec Empire was a triple alliance. Another word for it was the Triple Alliance. And that was the alliance of three big cities, which were inhabited and ruled by three different peoples, three different nations, you might say. And the Aztec Empire, I have to pause, my daughter is coming into the house. Hold on. Okay, I'm going to end this now, because now I have to go be with my girl, and and this is long already, and so then I will do another part of this next. So this will be Mesoamerica Part I.